Welcome to Genshin Impact 3.4 first half, where Hoyoverse hates money, because we've got Dehya and Cyno banners up right now. Let's compare these two characters, to give you an idea of who to pull for between the two, or if you should pull at all. Let's start with Dehya. What does she do? Her elemental skill puts down a fiery sanctum field, lasting for 12 seconds with a 20-second cooldown, that cuts any damage your active character takes in it by about half, and transfers it to Dehya, where she takes it in small ticks. Additionally, characters inside the AoE of the field will have increased interruption resistance, and her first Ascension passive further boosts that resistance even further for the first 9 seconds after casting the skill. Its other use is once every 2.5 seconds, when an enemy takes damage, the field will do a coordinated pyro attack and generate pyro particles, sort of like Albedo's Transient Bloom from his skill. With her fourth Ascension passive, if Dehya goes under 40% HP, she'll heal herself by 20% and continually heal by 6% ticks for a little bit, giving her some form of sustain to keep sponging hits for your active characters. For Dehya's elemental burst, Leonine Bite, she goes into the Blazing Lioness state, where she busts out a set of pyro punches in a quick burst depending on how many times you press normal attack, up to 10 times. Dehya's burst has a 70 energy cost with an 18-second cooldown. This is counted as elemental burst damage. Why am I putting emphasis on that? Because this means that she does not work with normal attack based effects. You know, like Xingqiu and Yelan's bursts. Oh, did I mention that it also has a standard internal cooldown? Internal cooldown, for those that don't know, is basically how fast an element can be applied to an enemy. For example, some characters like Diluc have talents that don't have an ICD. In this case, Diluc's skill, Searing Onslaught, can apply pyro every time it hits an enemy and can trigger elemental reactions if the supporting element is fast enough to keep up. Dehya, on the other hand, has standard ICD, meaning that she only applies pyro every third hit or 2.5 seconds. Since Leonine Bite is considered burst damage and cannot activate effects like Xingqiu's Rain Swords or Yelan's Exquisite Throws, the only way for Dehya to get any meaningful reaction damage is by applying the element beforehand with characters like Mona or Kokomi. Hell, if anything, she'll be helping your support's reaction damage more than doing her own. Last thing to mention about her burst is that it takes away the fiery sanctum field generated from her skill, giving her less interruption resistance of her own when she is on field for 4 seconds, making her unable to generate elemental particles for herself, but being able to be knocked back and even frozen by enemies. Dehya being able to be frozen is especially bad, since you typically get out of being frozen earlier by mashing the jump command, and if you accidentally jump in her Blazing Lioness state, her burst just gets cancelled. No joke. You can jump during what appeared to be a scripted burst and just completely stop it entirely. Only after the attack sequence is done does she put down the fiery sanctum field again, not refreshing it so that it lasts another 12 seconds, but keeping whatever timer it was on before. Dehya's offensive power on her skill and burst are both partial attack and HP scaling, so that generally results in her having lower scalings overall to accommodate. Well, in her case, ruin her. Since her primary function is as a damage tank with her HP, and she uses attack for offense, it lends to her not excelling in any stat and feeling like you lose on something with her because HP is not as effective as attack for her damage output. Now that we've gone through her kit, what are her pros and cons? Dehya offers your team a damage redirection where the damage you take with your active character is reduced by about half and sends it to Dehya for her to sponge. That same field can send out a coordinated hit of pyro when enemies take damage, that can be useful when setting up reactions like burning or burgeon. Now, the cons of Dehya. Oh lord. So, she can sponge the damage from the rest of the team. In what world would anyone need that? Just run a shield. Your team is still taking damage with her. Just because she takes some of the damage doesn't mean the rest of your team is invincible. You're gonna need a healer anyways. She doesn't give your team anything to consider using her over other alternatives. Why transfer a portion of your incoming damage if you can just not take damage at all using a shielder? Her Fiery Sanctum, while it can activate on any type of damage an enemy takes every 2.5 seconds and triggers reactions, Toma gives you a shield and shoots a wave of pyro in front of him when you use a normal attack, up to every second. Her burst lacks in damage and can't even activate your usual vaporized setup effects in Xingqiu or Yelan. In every single scenario that you could think of using her in, she is a direct downgrade in damage. But let's put her damage numbers aside for 1 second. Her functionality in the damage redirection or coordinated attacks are also not worth pulling for. Damage reduction? You can just have damage negation with shield characters. Coordinated attacks? Toma does that, and you can activate his faster anyways. Though, with how those effects work on Dehya, they can be a side grade to something like a Ganyu Melt team. Dehya's burst damage is not worth much either. With its inherently low scaling, high energy requirement, its 70 cost, and the fact that you're losing damage if you play her on field to trigger Fiery Sanctum's coordinated attacks to give her own particles, standard ICD, and inability to use the usual Hydro supports to trigger Vaporize. Hell, when Mono Pyro is considered to be one of her better teams, that's pretty bad. You know, the team that's primarily carried by Xiangling, Kazuha, and Bennett. Yeah. Dehya's situation is that bad. I cannot consciously or earnestly suggest you to go for Dehya with the state that she's currently in. Who knows, I could be wrong in the upcoming weeks, but with how Hoyoverse has announced that she will become a mainstay on the Wanderlust Invocation, better known as the Permanent Banner, starting from version 3.6, I wouldn't get my hopes up. The best we can hope for is maybe a dedicated artifact set, but even that would not be enough to cover for her damage nor her inherent flaws. Now that I've covered Dehya, what's Cyno's shtick? Cyno is an Electro Hyper carry that primarily wants to use his Elemental Burst and all of the Electro-related Dendro reactions to deal damage. His Elemental Burst, Sacred Rite, Wolf's Swiftness changes his normal charged and plunge attacks into Electro along with giving him a buff of 100 Elemental Mastery. During this burst, an outline of an eye will appear every 4 seconds or so. As per his first Ascension passive, timing your Elemental skill usage as it shows up will extend the duration of your burst by 4 seconds, up to 18-second max duration, and fires off 3 Dustarker bolts that greatly increases DPS. So, that's kind of it for how he works. You want to use your normal attacks, and when the eye outline shows up, you use his elemental skill to deal more damage and extend the burst duration. But his burst costs 80 energy to activate, and because he is burst reliant, you need some way to get his burst back on cooldown. Luckily, unlike characters like Dehya or Xiao, he can generate particles within his burst. That all being said, Cyno's gameplay centers around him being an on-field carry that wants every team member's abilities up before activating his burst to stay on-field for the majority of your team's rotation. Keep in mind though that most supporting effects don't last for the full duration of his burst, so playing his teams optimally will lead to you swapping out of Cyno prematurely most of the time. But of course, if you swap out too early, you lose out on his damage and may even accentuate his energy problem. Cyno does face some competition in characters like Kutsing and Yaimiko that can basically cover his role but are better in other ways like being able to swap out or not being entirely burst reliant. Speaking more on his burst, it does mention that he gets more interruption resistance that sounds like it would help him comfortably execute his combos, but in all honesty, unless you're stacking other interruption resistance effects like Xingqiu's Rain Swords, it's better to treat it as if it wasn't there, since it's very weak on its own. With his Ascension 4 passive, you are further incentivized to build more Elemental Mastery on Cyno due to him getting a damage boost on his Path Clearer normal attacks and Dustarker bolts from his Ascension 1 passive, but also due to the inherent nature of the teams you're using him in, the Dendro related ones. But honestly, it's not a major difference between an attack or EM Sands, so it's basically whichever one has the better substats, unless you have his signature weapon. Now that we've gone through everything Cyno can do, let's get into his pros and cons, starting with the pros. Cyno can be a great on-field damage carry that can apply Electro over a prolonged duration, typically amazing for Aggravate or Hyper Quick Bloom. He can be very rewarding if you like a character that needs some change in his playstyle to fully make use of him with his time skill presses when the eye outline periodically appears, and can even add some extra skill hits in between with the Thundering Fury set. His cons are that he can be energy hungry, depending on what team you're running him with, and since he is heavily burst reliant, that can be a major issue in building him. Cyno is an option for Aggravate or Hyper Quick Bloom teams, but not the only one. In fact, he can be seen as a similar alternative to Keqing in playstyle. Most supporting effects don't last the full duration of his burst, which can lead to a damage loss if you don't set supports up in a planned order to maximize his DPS and how long he can keep achieving it. Overall though, Cyno is a fine character that, sure, may not be the best, but if you like his character and how he plays, Cyno can clear all the content in the game no problem. Having gone through both characters, now comes the question of the video. Should you pull for Dehya or Cyno? If you had to pick between the two, Cyno. Dehya just has way too many problems for me to recommend getting her in the current state that she's in. And I should know, starting with version 3.6, you can start losing your 50/50s to her since she's being added to the standard banner. It does baffle me that Hoyoverse decided to make a character this bad, when Tignari is also a standard character and he is amazing for the role he fills. But that's just how it goes, I guess. Of course, whether you want her or not is up to you, especially if you wanted the game to be harder, even if it's artificially. Cyno is still a fine character to choose to clear most of the game's content should you like his playstyle. He's not amazing, not bad, just alright. Let me know in the comments if you plan to or have already pulled on these banners. Who'd you pulled for? Or if you're skipping for another round of banners. If you enjoyed the video, then kick that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.